I guess we'll get rolling. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Alberta AgriSystems Living Lab's Rotational Grazing webinar for 2023. My name is Adrienne Heron. I'm the Living Lab's Knowledge Translation and Transfer lead. There's our website there at the bottom if you're interested in more information. The Alberta AgriSystems Living Lab is led by Alberta beef producers, and here's a list of our partners. The Living Labs program is funded by the Climate Action program with the federal government. We would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge we're grateful to live, work, and be in relation with the people from across many traditional territories covering all regions of Alberta. This acknowledgement is to reaffirm our commitment and our responsibility to improving relationships and our own understanding of local Indigenous people, their cultures, and knowledge. So our agenda for this evening is Dr. Edward Bork will be speaking. His presentation is titled Grazing Systems, a Brief Introduction. Marcel Busz is speaking about the Mattheis Ranch and practical approaches to rotational grazing. And we're lucky to have Sonia Shank join us this evening to speak about the off-graft rotational grazing program. And then we'll follow up with some questions and answers. So with that, I'm going to hand control over to Dr. Edward Bork. Dr. Bork, you can override my screen. Perfect.
You should be able to see my screen now, I hope.
I can.
Okay. Oh, I'm just gonna bring my cursor up here if I can, my pointer. Oh, I don't want that. Okay, it doesn't want me to bring up the pointer. That's fine. Okay, thank you, Adrienne. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, which is what I hope is going to be a fairly informal discussion and conversation about grazing systems. I promised Adrienne that I was going to keep this very short, and those of you that know me know that sometimes I tend to be long-winded. So I'm going to try to keep this to about a dozen slides or so and really talk a little bit about just grazing systems and introduce what they are. Most of us that are in this webinar are probably very familiar already with what grazing systems are, but I'm going to share with you my perspective anyways in terms of what grazing systems are trying to do from a production potential perspective in terms of impacting patterns of livestock utilization and even patterns of forage growth. So I'm going to try to keep it fairly broad. So grazing system, you know, if we're thinking about what a definition is, it's really a recipe or a protocol specifying where, when, and how often we're going to graze our landscape by cattle or sheep or whatever we're utilizing. And so it's meant to be an adaptive protocol, which means it's subject to change based on whether we're early or middle of the season or late in the season. And of course, from year to year, this year being a relatively dry year, you're going to see a lot of changes to how we're grazing. So grazing systems are going to be highly adaptable. And this is to be expected. So I think what you're going to hear from Marcel today is probably a big part about how he has adapted to deal with a varying climatic condition and varying production over time. And I'm sure we'll have a conversation about that. So the goal, at least the theoretical goal to me of any grazing system, is really to balance grazing impacts on vegetation with plant recovery. And this is given the reality that all grazing animals exhibit a very high degree of selectivity when they're out trying to eke out a living. And what that means is that they are going to determine where in the landscape they're going to feed. So for example, when you look at that little landscape on the right side of your screen, they're going to decide, are they going to graze at the bottom of the hill on the slope, or are they going to graze at the top of the hill? But even within each topographic position, they're going to make further decisions. Are they going to feed in the forest or the shrubland or the open grassland? And then even within each one of those habitats, they're going to make further decisions based on what feeding stations they're going to decide to feed at. It might be within a little bit of a moisture area, or it might be in a little bit of a hilltop. And then they're also going to make complex decisions in terms of what plants they're going to feed on. And that selectivity works to our advantage, as I'll point out in a moment, but it also can work to our disadvantage because we can get patchiness in use. So why do we want to control these animal impacts? Well, the most obvious one is that we are going to try to utilize these grazing systems to manipulate where, when, and how often animals are grazing specific plants and plant communities. So the animals are our customized forage harvesters, and we can think of the grazing system as the tool that we use to try to balance patterns of utilization with the plant tolerance to defoliation and therefore their regrowth potential. And of course, that has spillover effects, such as maintaining pasture range health or pasture health. So we want to prevent overgrazing of different plants and plant communities. We want to conserve soils, so making sure there's enough litter in place and we're not increasing the amount of bare soil and causing undue levels of erosion. We want to control weed infestations. That middle picture there is one of the sites that I did work at about 25 years ago out in the Stony Plain area. That's an extreme example of a Canada thistle infestation. And if we're grazing on public land, we also want to support other land uses. So that might be making sure that we leave enough residual material to support wildlife, for example, elk grazing, or maintain biodiversity. And we want a healthy plant community to sequester carbon and store and filter water. So there's all kinds of reasons why we're trying to control where, when, and how impactful our grazing is in the landscape. And really, if we take this down to kind of the forage grazing dynamics, this graph to me kind of encapsulates that. So the first thing to think about is that forage growth is non-linear during the growing season, which basically means if we start out in late April in southern Alberta or in May in central Alberta, plants go through this relatively slow period of growth during which they're developing roots, they're activating their meristems, they're pulling up energy reserves. And that's really the slow growth phase that's needed to build up the initial leaf area. And once the plants have reached the point where they have enough leaf area to really start to ramp up their growth, that's the period which we refer to as range readiness. And it's after that that the production tends to be very, very high. So we get a very high level of biomass increment on a per daily basis, for example. And that's really the bread and butter of most of our production. So it's rapid growth, forage is plentiful and very high quality. And in that forage growth curve, that marks that stage 2 that I've denoted there. Now, in a perfect world, we would try to keep plants in that stage 2 as long as we can, ideally the entire growing season. But if we don't graze them, they ultimately get to the point where they start to mature. They produce a seed head, and then their productivity is going to go down. So really what we're trying to do is we're trying to keep the plants in that rapid growth stage for as long as we can, provided we have growing conditions that are conducive to it. For example, available soil moisture. And we want to try to minimize the number of plants that are in that slow growth phase, which is either plants that are stressed with very little leaf area and are small, that's on the left side of that curve, or plants that are over mature and they're simply slowing down their growth because they're reaching senescence. So it's understanding that plant growth is nonlinear. Sustainable grazing then balances the amount of biomass that we're removing with the amount of regrowth that we're going to get. And the simple rule is that it takes leaf area to make leaf area. So if we take off too much biomass and we get to heavy use, we don't have enough leaf area and not enough root mass left for those plants to really regrow effectively. Okay, so what are the types of grazing systems? Well, there are dozens and dozens. I'm not going to go through all of them. But just to make a point, I'm going to compare 3 basic systems. The first one is zero grazing, which is basically a feedlot system that we're all familiar with. So in that context, we don't allow the animals to go and feed for themselves. Instead, we bring the forage to them. And we all know how a feedlot works. The advantage is that we can control intake and quality. We can specify how much feed they're getting and the quality of that feed on a daily basis. The disadvantage is it's very expensive, and of course it's relatively inefficient because you have to harvest that biomass, transport it, feed it, and then ultimately get rid of the manure afterwards. Then we've got systems where these are put and take systems, or continuous or season-long grazing, where you put animals out into a large pasture at very low densities for the entire grazing season. So there's no movement, no rotation, and therefore maximum selectivity. So going back to this notion that animals are selective in their environment at the landscape level, at the plant community or habitat level, at the patch and at the plant level, these animals grazing under continuous grazing have very high selectivity potential. What's the advantage? Well, because the animals can be very selective day after day, hour after hour, week after week throughout the entire grazing season, it maximizes their individual animal weight gain. So they can put on as many pounds per head per day as possible. The disadvantage is that forage use is uneven. So you might get areas of the pasture that are completely underused, and you might get other areas that are repeatedly overused day after day, week after week. And those plants would then decline in plant vigor and plant growth and lead to degradation. What does that look like in terms of the growth curve? Well, how that manifests is that these continuous or season-long grazing patterns have the potential to lead to a very large proportion of the plants that are either ungrazed with little to light use. And so those plants would manifest themselves at the end of the growth curve, at the top end, and therefore be relatively low in productivity because they would reach senescence very quickly. On the other hand, heavily grazed plants would be forced, because of the high level of leaf area removal, into that slow growth phase at the bottom of the curve. So in these continuous grazing pastures, we run the risk of having a large proportion of plants either at the top end of the curve, undergoing slow growth, or at the bottom end of the curve, again undergoing slow growth due to heavy utilization. And so those plants, from an efficiency perspective, from a light capture and conversion into more biomass, in terms of that efficiency, that would be relatively low. Okay, so what's the solution? Well, it's to implement some kind of rotational grazing. And so this is basically taking a large area, dividing it up with permanent fencing or electric fencing. And this is what we're really here to talk about, and to implement some kind of rotational systems where we have rest throughout portions of the grazing season and the growing season. Across Western Canada, roughly 75% of producers are adopting some kind of rotational grazing. In the Edmonton area, it's about 57%. The advantage to this, well, we can improve the uniformity of forage use. So this is the spatial utilization across the landscape, and maybe even the spatial utilization of different plant communities. And that in turn will increase plant vigor because we're maintaining more uniform levels of leaf area on those plants and therefore help maintain range health. The disadvantage, of course, is the added cost of fencing, and you have to provide water for animals in each one of those pastures and the labor for movement. So there's many permutations here, and I'm going to let Marcel talk about the system that he's implemented at the Mattheis Ranch, and then we can go through pros and cons. Adaptive multi-paddock grazing is a system with a large number of relatively small pastures where you use high stock densities to attain much greater control of the spatial use patterns. It could be a checkerboard pattern, as you see on the left here, or a wagon wheel type approach, as you see on the right. The goal is to control plant stress levels and therefore enhance plant regrowth and production throughout the growing season. And so looking at our growth curve, this is how this basically manifests. Again, what we're trying to do is minimize, and we'll never get rid of underused plants and heavily used plants. There always will be some of those. But on average, by implementing these systems, we might be able to get a larger proportion of the plants and the vegetation maintained in that moderate use category so that we're in that sweet spot where we get more rapid and sustained growth over time. That's the objective. Okay, I'll just finish with a little case study. Many of you have seen this before. I've done work looking at Canada thistle control for many, many years. And one of the things we did is we use rotational grazing, high intensity, low frequency grazing to actually reduce very effectively the density of Canada thistle plants. This was work done in the Barrhead area, in the Rimbey and Wetaskiwin areas, and at one other location. And over a 3-year period, we were basically able to eliminate the weed. And the reason we were able to do it is we forced the livestock to overcome their natural aversion for Canada thistle. They don't want to eat it. They can eat it. It's not toxic. It's not poisonous, but they don't want to eat it. But if you force them to eat it, you can actually turn the thistle into a forage plant. But you got to force the animals to achieve that, which we used HLF grazing to do. Here's just a couple of visuals of this. You can see the high intensity, low frequency grazing system on the left and the continuous on the right. That was at Rimbey, and there's another example from Wetaskiwin on the bottom there. And the really cool thing about this is just kind of this is one of these rare situations where, as we implement the high intensity, low frequency grazing, it led to a win-win, because not only did we forced the cattle against their will initially, I'll tell you that right now, but we forced them to consume the Canada thistle, but we turned it into forage. And ironically, not only did we control the abundance of the weed, but we also increased the amount of biomass of the grass production, so the forage production. And it was because we had reduced the weed population to the point where the desirable forage grasses could become more productive. So it's one of these really interesting case studies where the cattle actually did the work for us through one of these rotational systems to not only achieve weed control, which made the county and the neighbors happy, but also increase forage production. Okay, so that's what I've got. That's my introduction. And with that, I think we'll hold the questions, right, Adrian? And I'll turn it over to Marcel.
All right, so you see my screen now. Mattheis Ranch overview. So I'm Marcel Busz. I manage the Mattheis Ranch for the University of Alberta. So the Mattheis Ranch is a 12,300 acre ranch, about 20 kilometers northwest of Dutchess, Alberta. It's also part of the Rangelands Research Institute. And for starters, I want to acknowledge that Edwin and Ruth Mattheis. Edwin was a Bachelor of Science and Engineering in 57, and Ruth a BA, Bachelor of Arts, in 58. They donated the ranch in 2010 to the University of Alberta. And at the time, it was the largest donation of land to a university in Canada. The ranch, Edwin and Ruth bought the ranch in 1977. And while owning the land, Edwin got a passion for diversity and birds and didn't want to see the land broken up. He also learned of the impact climate change would have on grasslands and how important it would be to have a university studying ways to protect grasslands. And I just want to thank Edwin and Ruth for their very generous gift. So the location of the ranch, this is kind of the Western Canada view. We're about 2 hours straight east of Calgary. This is a little closer in. We're about half an hour north of Brooks. And then we got, just go laser pointer here. This is Dinosaur Provincial Park here, and we're right along the Red Deer River, which is this right here. And then this is a map of the ranch with all its current fencing minus a few fences. So we're going to go over the overview of the environmental conditions and features. This actually picture is kind of grazed a little bit too hard there. That was from a week or two ago. So the total ranch again is 12,300 acres. About 10,000 of that is native prairie. About 1,000 acres are Ducks Unlimited wetlands. And then approximately 600 acres are pivot irrigated land. So the dominant species or dominant grasses are needle and thread. I'm going to say these pictures of the grasses and plants, I just Googled the names of them and cut and pasted the pictures. So they're not my pictures. So needle and thread grass, June grass, blue grama, sandgrass. Some of the dominant forbs are pasture sage, scarlet mallow, and some of the dominant brush species are prickly rose or wild rose, western snowberry, and thorny buffalo berry. So the pivot irrigated land, we have about 420 acres right now, or this year, that's perennial pasture with rotational grazing underneath. And then another 200 acres with annual forages with a mix of grazing and harvesting feed for forage. And on the irrigation, we have typically we have the availability to put 20 inches of water. This year we've been cut back to 16 inches because of low water in the river. So the soil landforms we got large areas with high sand content and grass covered sand dunes, flat and rolling loamy areas, river coulee breaks, and riparian areas. This is what our rainfall kind of looks like. It's kind of a noisy graph. I'll kind of go through it. This red line across like this, that is our long-term average of rain. This yellow line going across is since the inception of this graph, so the last 5-6 years. This green line is the rainfall every year. So this shows what, well, actually that just shows up to May. We're at 1.7 total precipitation for the whole year. And then this blue line, it's a little different. It shows the 12 months, what we've had in the last 12 months. So we're dipping down to 8.4 inches of total precipitation in the last 12 months now. I kind of keep that blue line in there because it kind of gives me a little more of a heads up of how dry we are, or what the moisture conditions really look like. So now I'm going to go kind of into a bit of a ranch tour. I was told to make this kind of practical, and I thought no better way of just showing some pictures of what we got going on. So this is pastures, water sources, and fencing. So first of all, I'm just going to use this is some mapping software I use. I use Google My Maps and Google Earth. They're kind of the same, but kind of different. They have some advantages. Google My Maps is shareable. So you can look at it on your phone and see what other people have done. Google Earth has more functionality. You can have more items on it. You're limited by only 10 layers on Google My Maps. So now I'm going to switch over and I'm going to look at our Google Earth. So now you should be seeing the map of the ranch on Google Earth. Is that right?
Looks good, Marcel.
Okay, good.
Yep.
Okay, so this again is the perimeter of the ranch. And then I'm going to click on, this is the pasture boundaries. And then on top of that, I'm going to add all the electric fence. So the red lines are all electric fence. I'll get rid of some stuff here. And then we got probably about 10 miles of shallow buried pipeline where we have watering sources on. So the main, let's see, can you see my mouse, I guess? The start of the pipelines are in this area right here. And then they feed in 3 to 4 directions feeding. Initially, the pipelines were put in for some pastures that didn't actually have reliable water sources, but I designed it in a way so we can do some more cross fencing. We also have a ditch system. You can see the green line there, and those green lines, and we can run water out of those wetlands on wetter years to fill ponds and stuff all the way along those and for water sources. And then this is where all the research sites are right now. I think there's 70 or so research sites that they have fenced off areas where there's keeping cattle out of areas and then comparing. And then we've also got lots of oil and gas to deal with. So all the pins are wells, or that's all mostly gas wells. And then all the green lines are gas line or buried gas lines. And then I've also got another layer here that this just shows all the legal land descriptions. I have this on Google My Maps because often I get phone calls from oil and gas people and they say, I'm in section 23 and we're doing this. And I'm like, well, where's section 23? So this way I can figure that out on when I'm out in the field rather than looking at the map. So then I'll go back to my PowerPoint presentation. There we go. That's be a blank slide right now. So, and now we'll move on to different types of fencing that we've got going on. Here, this is not my recommended option. We've got a barbed wire fence with high tensile wire on their insulator. And inevitably, this is what happens. Barbed wire snags, a deer runs through the fence or something, or hits the fence, and barbed wire snags on the electric fence and grounds out the system, causing problems. This is the next option, is just wood posts with high tensile wire and insulators. This is the kind of the current option that I use mostly. We got it's kind of a white, it's a Pasture Pro post. There's a cotter pin that holds the wire on here, so no insulator required. The post is the insulator. This particular post is a wood plastic composite. I also have a fiberglass post that looks quite similar to that. And then this is what I use to push the fiberglass versions of the post in. I just push them in with the bucket of the tractor. We've got this pipe here that I bolted onto the tractor, and that's just how deep we got to go. And it go with two people, and you just go along and put fence in the ground, or fence posts in the ground. So the next thing is with electric fence, you have to put at your gates, you got to go either underground or overhead to get your power from one side of the fence gate to the other side. I would not recommend going underground with just this wire right here is supposed to be able to be direct buried, and I've had to dig too many of them up and replace them. So they all go in poly pipe now if I do put it underground. That way, if there's a failure, you can just pull it out and poke a new one in, and you're off to the races again. So that's on one side of the fence. So then I've made a plow that I also bolt onto the bucket of the tractor. I just stick the pipe through a piece of chain like this and pull it in the ground. You can go 20, 30 feet easy with it. Just slides the pipe through the ground. Saves a lot of time on digging if the ground isn't too hard. If the ground's too hard, the bolts just shear off. Works. So most of the time now I put in an overhead gate because I've had too many failures with underground. This option is a wood post, wood 2x4 going up, and then we've got a wire. I don't know if you can see that going across here like that. And then this is the more recent iteration of it. This is a fiberglass pipe and then a fiberglass rod that's going up. So the fiberglass pipe is our insulator as well. So then we got our wire going over top and over like that. Now I just have one or two of those right now. I have just started using those. So then the gate assembly. One side of the gate, this is how it starts out. Like it starts with an insulator. This way, your gate is dead once you disconnect it. And then this is the other end. I'm using a wire rope, and then about 3 feet of electrified bungee right here, and then a gate handle like that. And then this is also, I don't know if you can see that real well, is the preferred method here of attaching to the fence. We just come off the fence with the wire, through an insulator and then tie a loop that we can hook our hook on. This is the preferred handle that we have on the end, but not these. These I don't have. I'm not a huge fan of these. They tend to break off if you run cows through a gate. Someone will inadvertently rub on it accidentally when they're going, like you're moving a herd through a gate, and break it off, and you got to put a new one on. So I haven't had any of the wire ones break yet. So then probably about half of our land we run on solar energizers, like with a solar panel. So we got I think this is a 125 watt solar panel, and then I got a cooler here that I'm keeping my energizer and battery, and I have another picture of that. And then we got the wire coming out here going to a ground grid. I think there's 5 or 6 10-foot ground rods on this particular energizer. So this is what it looks like inside the cooler. We got our energizer, battery, charge controller. So the charge controller is a necessity because you don't want to overcharge your battery, and then also what it does is it stops you from over discharging your battery, so you keep your battery in better health for longer. So then some considerations for using ground rods. Rule of thumb is 3 feet of ground rod per joule of energizer. So a 15 joule energizer is 45 feet of ground rod. So then you want to place your ground rods about 10 feet apart, and also place in a moist area. So we have our main fencer is 36 joules and has 10-foot ground rods, and they're all beside a pond, so they're always wet. So we always have a good ground. Often people have problems with the fence, it's because they don't have a good enough ground. So then, it's also a good idea to have some switches involved. There's a couple different styles here. We got this like blade style here, and this toggle switch, call it. This is actually pretty close to this. This is kind of a busy spot. Like it's kind of close to the main energizer, but the fence goes off in 3 directions. We got 1, 2, and then on this post here, 3 different switches so that we can shut certain areas off. 1 for repairs, 2 for if you have certain times of the year, like lots of times in June, ends up being lots of grass touching our fence, and then it grounds out the fence too much, and we can turn off certain areas to just push more power to other parts of the fence. So now we got starting with some water troughs. These are kind of the first water troughs we had, and the pivots. We're actually still using them. It's just an oval steel water trough. Initially, it was designed as a portable. We got a hitch right here, and there was wheels that we could stick on. Now I just leave them in place. Just like felt like I was moving them all the time, so I left them there permanently. Yeah, this watering site, we've got a gravel base here, but every once in a while we have to fix it up a little bit because they dig a little bit of the dirt away. So this is another option we had. We had a tire. It has an aluminum plate on the other side where the wheel rim would go. So that holds the water in. And then we had a chain hooked on it that I could just drag it from pasture to pasture. This one also kind of just sits there now. I got tired of moving troughs around. We just have to move them too far. And when I'm too far away from my pump site on my water lines, it just doesn't have the storage capacity for a larger herd of cattle. So this was another option. When that tire option was too small, I'm like, well, I'll make a way bigger version. I used it for 1 year. It was kind of a pain in the butt. It was hard to find a good level spot where it wouldn't overflow out one side. And then over the winter, the first winter, it developed a massive leak and it just ended up getting parked. So I'm not really a huge fan of portable large water troughs. So this is another option we've got. It's just a 1,000-gallon poly trough. It was good because it had lots of storage capacity, but I found the cows would come, drink the water down to a lower level, and then the calves couldn't reach the water. We're still being used. We have to replace it yet, but yeah. So and then the wires going across are more just to hold it in place in the wintertime when there's no water in it, or like right now there's no water in it. This is the same water trough. It's also not in the most ideal location. It's kind of at the bottom of a hill on both sides. It's kind of in a little bit of a hole right here. I should have put it in a different spot. And then we got, it services 4 pastures here. We got 1, 2, and then 3 gates. So with the 3 gates, we can supply each pasture separately with water. I would make in the future, I would make this a little bit bigger, just so that there's room for a cow to drink and then cows to pass each other walking behind there. Just it maybe got a little overcrowded sometimes. We busted gates down. So this is the most recent generation. Here we got our fiberglass posts as our overhead. The same idea. We got 1 trough servicing 4 pastures. At each of these posts, there's a fence going out. So I got a closer up picture. So the idea is we got a big tank to hold lots of water, just because our supply and our line maybe couldn't keep up when you had like our pastures there are about 80 to 100 acres. So then the cows all decide to come in all at once. So this gives us a little more surge capacity. So the pipeline fills the big trough, the big black one, or the tall one. And then there's another large capacity float valve that fills this lower one. And then this trough is a little lower. I think it's 19 inches. And that way the calves are able to reach the water easier. That's kind of just my newest design. I got 2 of them installed. Haven't used them too much yet. My concern when I put them in was with the black poly was I'd get heat, but the other concern with the clear, like more of a translucent white, was that I would get algae in. Now that I've had them for a while, I've had one sitting there with no cattle on it for about 3 weeks, and we've had some hot weather and the water is still cool, so I don't think heat will ever be an issue. Especially if there's cows drinking on it, there's enough flow of fresh, cool water. So this is where our pasture pipelines all originate. We got a pump, we got a wet well that comes out of this pond. It's our most reliable water source, or one of our most reliable water sources. And then we got a wet well that feeds into a pump, and then so we have a submersible pump here, and it feeds into feed, and it goes 4 directions with our water lines out of that pump house. And then this is a spot where it's kind of hard to see. You see my foot there, but where my cursor is coming in, this is where the supply line is. This is above ground. I just had a spot where there was some valves. Otherwise, it's below ground. But this stretch here is all above ground, and it's all grown in. So you don't have to really work. Like you could lay water lines on top of the ground, and you don't have to worry about the sun beating on them and getting the water hot, because they get covered with grass. This little thing right here was a quick attach for my portable water troughs. That's when I was using portable troughs. And then I have basically an isolation valve, so the water comes in this way and splits, goes either direction. I can isolate certain areas to if I need to work on stuff or whatever. And I'm going to tell you, I stole this picture from Barry Irving's website. Thank you, Barry. I think you're here. This is kind of what it looks like when we're plowing a pipeline in. So it's just they're 8 to 10 inch, maybe 12 inches deep. It takes you more time to hook the pipe up than it does to actually plow a mile of pipe. We can get like a mile and a half of pipe, depending on like a 2-inch roll. You get a mile of pipe on a roll. Inch and a half, I think it's a mile and a 1.4, I think, or something like that. I don't know. Barry would have to tell me. So what do our rotations look like? Well, I guess it depends. On our native prairie, our rotations are pretty long rest. We're going 14 months right now. And the idea is to not hit the same pasture at every time of the same year, or at the same pasture every year at the same time. So our current pastures, we don't have everything divided up real good yet. So the time in the paddocks vary from 5 to 20-ish days based on the number of cattle and size of the paddock. Our irrigated pastures generally get 3 grazes per year, 2 short quick grazes and then 1 longer one. And the length of time in the pasture varies depending on how fast we're moving the cattle. So a good start for figuring out how many grazes per year is 1 graze per 10 inches of precipitation. That works pretty good for our native prairie. That's kind of, we're right on the mark there. And also with our irrigation, if we're getting about 10 inches of precipitation and we're adding 20 inches of water, we're getting 3 grazes. So that number works out. And then how do we cope with low moisture conditions and rotational grazing in a low moisture environment? So all of our cattle here are custom. And if rain conditions warrant sending the cattle home, we just send them home. I feel bad, but I don't feel bad at the same time. With long rest, we have a fair bit of stockpiled grass that can carry us further into a drought without making too drastic of changes. And then for about half our cattle, we've been stockpiling grass for winter grazing. And that also gives us some extra land to work with on a lower rainy year. And we just send cattle home in the winter if we don't have enough grass for winter. And then ideally you want to carry the amount of cattle that you could graze in a less than average rainfall year. That way you're got some protection that way. So now we're going into the ideas on paddock design. So ideally, a pasture design should have low infrastructure cost, good distribution of manure, low labor requirements, and then also be adaptable. But there's a balance between all these, and there's probably 1,000 or more ways to do it. So here are some diagrams that came from the Canadian Cattleman and from the episode or magazine on June 11, 2015, so what, 9 years ago. So this is based on a quarter section of grass, and so this is the water source, and then we got a laneway each way like this, so your cattle have access to water by going there. So this particular one has 4 miles of cross fence. It has fairly even grazing but you're going to get quite a bit of manure accumulation in your alley, and it's kind of got an advantage of low labor costs. This is a one alleyway down the middle system. It's kind of a long laneways. This has a little more cross fencing. Your grazing is maybe going to be a little more uneven. Maybe it's going to be, especially these far ones out here. You're going to get more grazing right here than right here, because by the time that cow has to walk, she has to walk 3/4 of a mile to get all the way to here for water. And then we're getting manure in the alley again, but the lower labor costs. But it would be handy for bale grazing, because you could put some temporary cross fence. You could set up your bale grazing in a paddock, and then you can put temporary cross fence, and your cattle can walk back for water. So this is the same idea. So then this is all little 10-acre parcels in quarter section, but then you're hauling the water with the water truck. So you're going to get good manure distribution because the cows are staying in there. They're not going to be like in the laneways before. There's increased capital costs and labor costs. Hauling water every day would be fun for about a week, and then after that, I think the fun would be all out of it. So then this is the same system again, but now we're putting a watering site in each spot. So you're going to get the same benefits. This one lower labor, but increased capital up front to build it. I guess these small squares, my hesitation with that is like, if you ever want to do any field work, it's not going to be very fun to do some addition, like some pasture rejuvenation with a seed drill or haying on these little tiny 10-acre pieces. That seems like it would be a giant headache to me. This is a wheel spoke method, or a ship wheel. This is also a little more cross fencing. Your grazing is going to be centered around here, and like I think this area inside that is going to get really beat up. Manure distribution will all be in here, but it will be low labor cost. Then here's more of an adaptable system. We got 3 permanent fences, and then these dotted lines are like a temporary portable fence. It's maybe a little higher requirements, and I guess what's going to happen here is you're going to put a temporary fence like right there, and then you're going to work your way away from your watering site. That works okay if you don't, this doesn't take too long. If it only takes about 5 days to get down this laneway, they won't graze this first paddock if you're grazing here and it's only 5 days. So ideas on paddock design. So adding water infrastructure will increase manure distribution and make pasture design simpler, or design options simpler. So when you're adding watering sites, you want to place them in a high area, not like in the low spot like I did. And then plan on protecting the ground with some sort of apron on a watering site so that the cows don't dig that dirt away around your water trough or watering site. So we decided we were going to do kind of just look at some ideas for a piece of land that I'm not sure if they're Lee and Haley and McKay are online, but they're 20 kilometers west of Olds and Didsbury. Their land kind of there is kind of set stock a little bit. It's got some fencing, but we figured we'd give some ideas of what I thought maybe they could try. I got 4 options, but this is kind of what their place looks like right now. They got a little bit of cross fencing, but they all got to go back to this site for water. So this pasture gets pretty beat up. This is an old hay field, not much alfalfa apparently in it anymore. We got some natural grass, we got some poplar trees, some bush, and then this, I believe it's a compressor station or something, oil and gas, whatever. And so getting water to here is kind of a pain. They used to have another quarter to the northwest of this where they could water here, but they don't have access to that anymore. So I will pull up Google My Maps now. Right there. So now can you see Google Map? Right?
Yep, we can.
Okay. So this is Google My Maps. I use it. It's real cheap to play with fencing designs. It's real cheap to build a fence like this because you can like, hey, I don't like that. So this is the quarter, this black line. I'm going to add, I have a laneway idea. So this is a lane, it's going to be a laneway with temporary fences maybe. So the idea is the cows could walk down this laneway and then go to any of these pastures. You'll have like, say you have 3 portable fences, and then you would like leapfrog the fences as you move your cows through, move them around. That's kind of one idea. I will hide that one. So my other idea was, they talked that this area sometimes has water. And I figured maybe if they were to dig a pond there or dig a hole, that maybe it would always have water. Then you could also do temporary fence again like that. So then they wouldn't have to, cows wouldn't have to walk as far to get to water, which would maybe be an option. So I'll hide that version. And then the other version, another version is this. I figured maybe we could put a water line in like this. That blue line is a water line. The red line is a kind of a dividing fence. And then again, temporary fence. Not sure if they're, so because they have, right now they have a solar pump or solar trough here. And I'm not sure that they have the option to, if it would be able to pump down that pipeline. Maybe there's an option, I don't know. And then I got one other idea here. It's my pond and no temporary fence version. So it's a little more permanent fence. These red ones are permanent. So this is digging that pond again. And then, so we just have a short little laneway here that helps service these 2 pastures. And then maybe a little longer alleyway here to service those 2. So then we've got 8 pastures of a little more. Yeah, that's kind of my ideas for those ones. I think that's all I have for that. Okay, so then that was my ideas for that. And ultimately there's more ideas. I think having more people look at your diagram or look at what you're thinking of doing, the better, because then other people might say, hey, well, maybe this would work, or maybe that would work, or that idea won't work because of this. So.
All right. I hope you are seeing CFGA off-calf rotational grazing screen.
Yep,
excellent. All right, everybody, I'm going to be short and sweet so that you can get to the questions that you want to ask Marcel and Dr. Bjork. So my name is Sonia Schenk, and I am here today to present on the off-calf and CFGA rotational grazing program. I'm sure you're aware there is lots of funding recently going out under the Results-Driven Agricultural Research Grant, the CFGA grant, and as well now we have the RALP funding that is out there for rotational grazing. So obviously a lot of the content, there's lots of options out there for producers, and I'm just going to do a quick chat about the one offered by CFGA, and it kind of ties in a little bit to what Marcel has mentioned in terms of grazing plans. So we will go through. All right, so some of the off-calf goals, I'm not going to bother with this one. I'm sure you guys are very well aware and acquainted with it. We're looking to get some biodiversity and some carbon sequestration in through the use of rotational grazing on property in Alberta. So we're looking at the beneficial management practices of rotational grazing and small paddock grazing, similar to what we've discussed already today. CFGA has set up a support network within Alberta to provide some one-on-one support for producers who are that first step or that second step or that third step into looking at their property and how they could implement some rotational grazing programs. Marcel did mention, more eyes are great to take a look at a property to give you an idea of what can be done there. And we have some of this is on our Erica website, of people in the local areas who are available to help you to take a look at your property and discuss some of what they've managed to do and what's worked for them. But again, they're there to help you figure out how rotational grazing can be implemented on your farm. So we have some learning events like tonight. We'll be doing some field days out at the Mattheis Ranch, also at the Kinsella Ranch, in conjunction with Olds College. And then we've done a number, if you've attended any of the Greg Judy workshops that have gone on over the last month, that as well has been some of the learning opportunities that have been funded through the CFGA off-calf program. They've also put together some on-demand learning. So they've gone through with an online platform, and there are 6 modules in there. It's absolutely free for producers to sign up and use. You can go through, it's set up similar to a course to go through the modules. If there are certain parts that are of way more interest to you, then maybe you don't really need to look at a whole lot of extended grazing. You're just looking at summer grazing. Then there are some options to just go in and take a look at certain parts of the module in the online system. It's a combination of videos. Oh, sorry. We have videos, lots of videos, lots of the PDFs, so you can take a look at it. They're not sit down and hours of work. They're kind of sit down and you can go through a module, in an hour to get the pieces that you're interested in. So there's also some one-on-one learning with the grazing clubs in the area. So we had a number of grazing clubs that took place in the special areas last year. There were 3 of them, one out of Oyen, one out of Consort, and one out of Hanna. We also have one that's going on with the Grey-Wooded Forage Association just south of Red Deer, and they're doing some tailgate Tuesdays where they get producers together to kind of go over some of these rotational grazing concepts. And we also have the one-on-one learning. So if you're interested in having one of those mentors come out and take a look and work with you to develop a grazing plan for your property, there is funding available through CFGA with an application form, and you can go through and get somebody to come out, and it'll be reimbursed up to 85%. So if they charge you, the maximum they can charge you is $1,750 for getting the if, ands, or buts and working through your process. And then you would get a refund of the $1,500 through CFGA for that bill. As I mentioned, we have workshops going on across the province with all kinds of grazing clubs. If you're interested in participating in one, feel free to reach out, and you can either talk to Adrian or myself. Check out the Erica or the CFGA website, and we will find somebody local to get you involved with so that you'll be prepared for next year as well as anything going on for this year. So as we mentioned, there is funding available for the grazing plan development for producers who are seeking that individual assistance. You can work with a CCA or a PAG. However, we know that they are not always the ones who have all that practical on-the-ground experience. So we also have lists of producers who are eligible to work with you, who have some of the more practical on-the-ground hands, looking at things like the different types of watering systems or fencing systems that are out there. I'm sure if Barry wanted to chat later on, he can talk about the producers who've gone through the off-calf program, both through ARDAR and CFGA, because there's lots of pipelines going in to move some water this year. And then for 2024, there are going to be some on-farm implementation dollars going back out to producers. There were implementation dollars for 2022 and 2023, and those funds were all accounted for by the end of April of 2023. So they have been approved through Ag Canada for some additional on-farm implementation dollars that will hopefully get out and running for the 2024 season under the fencing, water systems, looking at improving pastures through increased legume and some grazing plan development. So you don't need to sign up for a grazing plan to access the online course. You can get a hold of myself, like I mentioned, the CFGA website, the Erica website, or talk to Adrian. She can get you the contact information. And I am going to leave it at that because I'm not the one you want to listen to. And the questions, I'm sure, are going to go out to the people who have had the most interesting parts to say today.
Thank you, Sonia. I see we still have lots of folks with us, so I'm going to ask if anyone has any questions, if they want to put them in the Q&A or the comments, the chat section. I'm sure Dr. Ford or Marcel or Sonia would be happy to questions.
Can I start with a question to Marcel?
Yes.
Sure. Okay. So Marcel, you've been doing a lot of cross fencing over the last number of years. So, you know, you mentioned that your grazing periods are from 5 to 20 days. Where do you think the sweet spot is? Like what's the ultimate goal for that environment? And I realize that that's a pretty arid environment, but where do you think the optimal number of paddocks is going to be, and how tight do you want to get those rest periods?
Or
are you there? Maybe you're there now, but I'm just wondering.
Like our 5-day graze period, like because our pastures are quite big, the logistics of moving cow-calf pairs in and out of a pasture, anything shorter, you're running like you're moving into the next pasture before you even got the first pasture in. So you're suddenly spread out between 3 pastures. Generally, what we're doing is I just like the day before I want to move cows, I just open the gate and I hope that most of them find the gate. And generally that works. Sometimes there's a bunch left behind, but like grazing, like if you're trying to skim over, like we just don't have enough, you just can't get there. So 5 days is probably as short as we can go, unless you're just like lowering a poly fence and they can go a little bit farther down your pasture, like permanent pasture. It's kind of, I think that's about as tight as we can go.
Thanks.
But I know some people go push that envelope really far and they put 1 million pounds per acre or something like that, and they're moving cows 10 times a day. I don't have time for that.
Yeah, and that's probably more applicable for a higher rainfall zone, right? But even at a 5-day grazing period, if you're talking grazing from May to the end of October, that would be 6 times 6. That's, you got to have 36 paddocks for the herd, right? So, you know,
yeah,
just doing the math, that's where my question's kind of coming from, you know. So there's often this conversation about what's the optimal number of paddocks per herd, and Carolyn Fitzsimmons and I and others at U of A have had that conversation with some industry folks recently, and I just wanted your perspective.
If you go by the ranch management consultant folks, they figure you need to have 12 pastures in order to maintain animal performance. If you have less, your animal performance actually goes down, according to that.
Great question. Does anyone who is on listening in, any of our participants, does anyone have any questions if they want to pop them in? Oh, perfect. I don't know, Marcel, do you have access? You need to read it to you. You're muted.
So this is from Sydney. I guess everybody can see that, or
I would just read the question, Marcel.
so she would like this, Sydney would like to know what is the most durable and longest lasting type of electric fencing system you have at Mattheis Ranch right now. Also, does the temperature fluctuations, shrinking and expansion affect fence flexibility for wildlife? The Pasture Pro fence, they've been pretty good. There's a lot of flex in there. I find, I don't know that temperature really has an issue on some of the better quality stuff, like maybe your Bay Guard stuff that you used to be able to get UFA. It had no stretch to it. I would stay away from that, but it's this the portable fences need to have some stretch. Electric fence that we use 12.5 gauge high tensile, and we've bought the stuff you can get UFA, and we bought the stuff you can buy from your farming or grazing guru guy, and I've had good success with both. As long as your fences are long enough, like you don't want short little 200-foot fences because there's no stretch in the fence, and I find that's when stuff gets broken. Because I know, for example, in one of our pivots we had, it was cross fenced, so in a T over top of the pivot, so the pivot went through the fence 4 times. Initially there was like these little radio antennas that the pivot would drive through. So then we had short 175-foot pieces of fence between each pivot tower. And one spring I had, I think there was 12 or 13 spots where like the fence was broken or the post was busted right off because wildlife had run through it. There's just, because it's so short, there's not enough room for stretch. But if you have your maybe 200 meters or what, 400 meters, a quarter mile, if you have a fence that long, there's enough stretch in the wire that, okay, it just bends down, pops right back up to where it came from. So hopefully that answers your question.
What type of wildlife are you dealing with, Marcel, at the ranch?
Deer, elk, moose, antelope, coyotes, cougars. Apparently someone saw a wolf in the area a little while ago.
Okay. We have another question. What kind of grass or legume mixes do you use to improve pasture composition?
That's a tough question for me. I'm not a plant identifier. Some of the stuff was here already before. I've been here 5 years, and some of the stuff was here before I started, so I don't know exactly what kind of grasses are in there. We do have in our pivot irrigation stuff, we've got quite a bit of sizer milk vetch in there. I almost think we're kind of getting to that point where we almost have too much. I might have to debated seeding some annual grass or annuals in there, like a barley or something like that with it, just to get more volume out of some more warm grasses. But otherwise, yeah, I guess we have some brome and some stuff. Our one pasture pivot has crested wheatgrass, some crested wheatgrass, but that's not ideal because, especially under irrigation, it grows early in the spring and then quits. So it's ideal to have, like, especially under irrigation, you want something that's going to grow year round or have more things in there that can grow year round. So
Ed, do you want to take a run at that?
Yeah, I could just chime in. So it's really going to depend where you are, what kind of soils you have, are they sandy, and so on. The key thing is just to make sure that there is an abundance of legumes in the system. So in terms of the Alberta AgriSystems Living Lab and some of the producers that we're working with right now, we do have some overseeding projects. So this, or interseeding, but into where producers are seeding direct into existing perennial forage stands where they would like to boost the amount of legumes. So in those cases, it really depends on the type of soil and what the preferences are for the producers. But by and large, it's sainfoin, Sicer milk vetch, and in some cases alfalfa that's being interseeded. So this is being drilled directly in, usually with a hoe drill or a direct drill, very shallow, to try to increase the amount of productivity and increase the amount of nitrogen availability, because that benefits the entire forage stand.
Awesome.
We do have quite a bit of alfalfa in some pastures too. Some people look at it like, you're going to put cattle on that, and I think we've had one calf die with bloat, and I don't think it was because I think there was something else wrong with it. I guess another question from Eric, or
I think, yeah, and I can address Eric's question. So I think the general rule is the more diversity you have, the better, simply because you get more complementarity in terms of the leaf area above ground. The plants are those are your photosynthetic panels. So the more layers that you have, the more species you have, the more likely you are to have, if you have dry conditions, some species will still thrive, or maybe not thrive, but they'll do okay, like crested wheatgrass or Russian wild rye, whatever you have in there. Whereas during the wetter years, the plants that are really going to thrive on having more water. So plant diversity inevitably becomes really, really important. And then making sure that there's legumes and those nitrogen fixers in there. So the key is really diversity. To Eric, no, unfortunately, we did not collect any soil carbon data in the HILF study that we did with the cattle grazing to control the Canada thistle, because that was done over 20 years ago now, and that was before the kind of big buzz on soil carbon. It would have been really interesting to look at that, but all the soil carbon work we've been doing has been going on since really about 2012, somewhere around there. So that predated that, but that is a really interesting question.
And Marcel, there's another question there from Eric a little further up, and he wants to know if you were able to extend the grazing season after starting the rotational grazing management.
Yeah. Of the last 5 years I've been here, three of them we've grazed all. We had normally, like in the summer, we typically have about 600 pairs, and the last 3 of those years we grazed 300 pairs through the whole winter. This past winter we grazed until early January, and then the snow just got too hard for the cows to dig into it.
Great. We have a question from one of our Living Lab participants. I'd like to know how often you graze in the pastures. Did you mention that you only graze them once every 14 months?
We are grazing once every 14 months. I've tried moving them faster over, like try skim over the whole thing quick, but it's just legit, like because we're low productivity land, we've got so much space, and moving cows over that much space, like if you got a herd of 250 cows on 4,000 acres, and to try cover all that 4,000 acres quick in the spring, it's hard to get everybody moved. It's hard. Yeah. So yes, we're doing pretty long rest.
And I think Marcel, you mentioned that you try not to graze the same area at the same time.
Yeah, we used to have the typical or the historical calving pasture where every year they calved in the same spot, and I've tried to move that around now.
Okay, we have another question. How do you deal with the low buried water piping in the winter? Does it all get blown out or drained, or can it handle stagnant water freezing inside the pipes?
I blow it all out. With that, between the 10 miles of pipe and the irrigation pivots, I just rent a big air compressor and I can do the whole works in one day. I pig 4 irrigation pivots, the underground main lines, and then all those pipelines in one day and have no issue. I don't know that I've heard some people say that they do not drain them, but to me it's less work to blow it out for that one day than have to find leaks, find busted fittings and leaks in the spring.
Forever. Okay, and we have another question. Marcel, when you referred to 12 pasture minimum, what would that be directly related to rest time required to boost productivity, or what other factors?
I think it has more to do with the plane of nutrition. The longer, like if you say you had 12 pastures and they were each in their 5 days, you'd have a 60-day rotation. And I think the idea is that the plane of the nutrition, you start with a high plane and then it slowly goes down and down and down until day 5 they're on they're eating the worst of that pasture, and then also it's up. So the less pastures you have, the longer you have to stay in them, and then they stay at that bottom plane, that low level for too long. So that would but if you can 5 day or less days, that plane of nutrition, that average is going to be higher than if you're longer. Does that make sense?
Yep. Awesome. Are there any other questions for Marcel or Dr. Bork or Sonia? Just give folks a minute because they're frantically typing.
And I think, Adrian, if there's any other follow-up questions, sometimes questions pop into someone's mind later on. They can always reach out to myself or more than likely Marcel on all the practical things. And we can also redirect folks that are interested in the pasture pipelines to Barry Irving's contact. So they're welcome to reach out to us after the webinar as well.
Absolutely. And then as a great lead in, well done, Ed. We also have a field day coming up on August 3rd in Leduc County, looking at 4R fertilizer management, field research on nitrification inhibitors, enhanced efficiency fertilizers. There's registration in the same area, agrisystemsll.ca/events. And then keep up to date with us with our Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can email me, that's my email. Our website's up there. And thank everyone very much for your time and attendance. I'd like to thank our panelists for taking time out of their evening to educate us. A link to the webinar will be emailed to you after the webinar is completed. And as Ed said, please reach out with any follow-up questions and we would be happy to answer them. I'd like to take this opportunity to wish everyone a safe and healthy, rain-filled summer with lots of good grass. So thank you everyone very much.